Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to BioSC 140 Human Physiology. This is the part 2 video for S3P3 cardiovascular physiology. All right, let's get right into it. So, flow rate is dictated by pressure differences, not absolute values. So, what's an absolute value? An absolute value would be 4. 32, like a specific number, 5, or 15, or 120. Pressure difference would be the difference between 120 and 0, the difference between 15 and 10, the difference between two numbers. So pressure is the force exerted by a fluid on the container holding that fluid. Vocab word, make a flashcard, underline it. Pressure is the force exerted by a fluid on the container holding that fluid. So when the aorta gets pumped up and it's squeezing on that blood that was just pumped out of the left ventricle, that force that the fluid is exerting on the aorta, that's pressure. Pressure gradient drives movement. Remember, things go from high pressure to low pressure. And it's that pressure difference, not absolute pressure. We'll get into a few more slides of exactly what we mean with that. But before then, let's look at this graph right here. So this is going to show pressure in millimeters per mercury throughout our circulatory system. So our left ventricle, you can see how it fluctuates from close to 0 up to about 120 and back with the cycle. As the blood is pumped in the aorta, which happens right here, as the blood is pumped in the aorta, you can see that it kind of fills up that aorta, that stretchy aorta, that balloon-like aorta. And then in between beats, it slowly constricts down, and we get down to about 80 pressure. And then the next heartbeat comes through and pumps it back up again. This trend line right here is MAP, mean arterial blood pressure. And as we move away from the heart, the high point goes down, the low point goes down, the range gets less and less and less. And eventually we're in the arterioles, and then the capillaries, and the venules, and the right atrium. We're always able to maintain proper directional flow. All right, so let's look at this absolute and difference example. So in the top example, we have 100 millimeters per mercury on the left side, and we have 75 millimeters of mercury on the right side. What direction on this top example is blood going to flow? There's 100 on the left, 75 on the right. It's going to flow, it's going to start on the high end, and it's going to move towards the low end. Perfect. What's the difference between 100 and 75? Well, the difference is 25 millimeters per mercury. Let's compare that example with this one on the bottom. 40 millimeters of mercury on the left, 15 millimeters of mercury on the right. What direction is blood going to flow? It's going to flow from high to low, so left to right. What's the difference between 40 and 15? Well, 40 minus 15 is 20 millimeters of mercury. Which example will have more blood flow? Faster blood flow? The top or the bottom? They're going to be equal. They're going to be equal. The top example has higher absolute values. 100 is larger than 40, 75 is larger than 15. But the pressure difference is equal in the two examples, so flow will be equal. Pressure difference, not absolute pressure. There's going to be a number of equations coming up. You need to be comfortable with these equations. You need to be comfortable with, if you change this variable, how will it change? There will be some practice problems. So this is going to be our first equation that we come across in this lecture. Pressure, or P, is equal to flow also known as Q, Q is flow, times resistance, which is R. So pressure is equal to flow times resistance. Resistance is equal to 8 length times fluid viscosity divided by radius to the fourth. So you don't need to memorize this one. This one you do need to memorize. But this one down here, you don't need to memorize. But I want you to understand a few things about it. I want you to understand the contributing variables. I'm not going to have you do any math regarding this one right here, but I do want you to understand the contributing variables. There will most likely be some math regarding this one on the exam. So we can take this equation, move some things around, and we get flow is equal to pressure divided by resistance. We can then substitute resistance for these variables right here. So vessel diameter contributes the most to resistance. I want to point this out. Resistance is to the fourth power. The fourth power. Any slight change, radius, my bad. Radius is raised to the fourth power in the resistance equation. Any change to radius is going to have a huge effect on resistance. Now, length is times 8, but I mean, really to the fourth, that's going to have a huge effect on resistance. So vessel diameter contributes the most to resistance. Now let's go piece by piece. So tube length. Tube length, you increase L, so you increase length, you increase resistance. Can you change the length of your vessels readily? Like let's say, oh, I just detected that my blood pressure is getting a little bit low. I should increase my resistance, my vascular resistance. So I'm going to make my tubes longer. Doesn't work like that. You put on 10 pounds, absolutely you're going to have, a longer tube system. You're going to have to grow new vessels to accommodate those extra pounds. But it's not quick. It's not something that you can quickly change in order to, affect blood flow. If you want to change your blood flow, you can't, just quickly change your tube length, right? So when we want to regulate flow, tube length is not a good way to regulate flow. That's a good way to put it. Tube length is not a good way to regulate blood flow in our bodies because we cannot quickly change tube length. Viscosity, so the thickness of our blood. The thickness of our blood. You increase N, you increase resistance. Is viscosity a good way for us to regulate our blood flow? Like if we want to increase or decrease blood flow, should we, I'm going to decrease the viscosity of my blood real quick so I can increase flow, or I'm going to increase viscosity so I can decrease flow. No, that's a terrible way to affect blood flow. Now, can fluid viscosity change? Absolutely. If you're really dehydrated, you're going to have thicker blood. If you have polycythemia, remember back to blood lecture what this is, an increased number of red blood cells, yeah, it's going to make your blood thicker. Smokers have thicker blood. And so fluid viscosity can change over time, but it's not a good way for us to control flow. Oh, I want to come back to this photo right now. So I know when I was a kid, I attached one straw to another straw to another straw to another straw, and I tried to drink some soda. Some of you might have had an experience with this or with some other form of extremely long straw. But let me tell you, it's tough. If you increase your tube length, it's going to be tougher to drink your drink. I've had milkshakes before. Milkshakes are more viscous than a glass of water. It's tougher to drink a milkshake through a straw than it is to drink water through a straw because of the viscosity difference. All right, now let's get down to tube radius. So Tube radius is the fourth. So it's going to have any change in radius is going to have a huge effect on resistance, which will have a huge effect on flow. So small changes in radius have a significant effect. Has anybody, if you've ever tried having I think it's called boba tea. It's the tea with the little tapioca balls. And they give you a very wide straw when you drink it. Water comes up really quickly. It's really easy to move that liquid and move those little boba tapioca balls up the straw. Compare that with trying to drink through one of these little stir straws. I believe these straws are actually meant for stirring more than drinking through, but I'll admit it, I've tried to drink through one of them before, and it is not easy. You cannot get a lot of liquid up through these straws. Radius has a significant effect on resistance. So pressure is equal to flow times resistance. You can use some algebra and move some terms around. Flow is equal to pressure divided by resistance. Flow is equal to pressure divided by resistance. Flow describes the volume that passes a given point in a given time. How much per minute? How many milliliters per minute? How many milliliters per minute pass through a certain spot? So right here in this example, you can see that there's one column of water providing a certain pressure. So we have equal pressures going into both the left and right tubes. We have a larger radius on the left tube, a smaller radius on the right tube. This one has a radius of 2, this one has a radius of 1. There's a huge amount more flow in the left tube. Same pressure, different radiuses, lower pressure due to the larger radius, lower resistance due to the larger radius. So same pressure, less resistance because of the larger radius, more resistance because of the smaller radius. The narrower the vessel, the faster the velocity flow. So the narrower the vessel, the faster the velocity flow. Perfect. All right, so hemodynamics, flow, pressure, and resistance. So we have flow is equal to pressure divided by resistance, and then we can break resistance down into the 3 terms that affect it: radius, length, and viscosity. Pressure is the stress on a system. Inefficient requires large pressure differences. Resistance, length, and viscosity. If we want to control flow, we can control pressure, which we do to some point. We have our heart producing pressure. We have the elasticity in our arteries maintaining pressure. But the thing is, there's a limit to pressure differences, using pressure differences to dictate flow. Your heart has to physically produce that pressure. And if your heart was having to beat and produce, 200 millimeters of mercury pressure every single beat, that would get your heart really tired. It would also put a lot of stress on your system. It would put a lot of stress on your heart. It would put a lot of stress on your vessels. 120 over 80, that or lower really is the ideal pressure to have within the human circulatory system. Once you start getting up to 130 over 90, 140 over 100, 150 over 110, that's a lot of stress on the heart. That's a lot of stress on your vessels. So it's not a good way to control flow. We have the limit of our pressure, but it's not like we use it, our bodies use it. Like when you exercise, pressure might go up some, but it's not like a good long-term way to control flow. There's limits, there's limitations to what we can do with it. Length and viscosity to affect this variable right here, length and viscosity. It's slow. If you need to change flow quickly, you can't just grow more tubes and increase the length. You can't just change the viscosity. They can happen over time, but it's really slow. You put on 10 pounds, you're going to have longer length of your vessels. Start smoking, get dehydrated, your viscosity will change. Radius, you can change radius quickly. Your sympathetic nervous system innervates your arterioles. Boom, you can change it quickly. It's rapid and potent. It's raised to the 4th power, so it has a large effect. Constriction will decrease radius, which increases pressure and you decrease radius, you increase resistance, which decreases flow. If you dilate, you increase radius, you decrease resistance, and you increase flow. You can see here, the constriction, less fluid goes through. No constriction, more fluid goes through. Same thing over here. The more constriction, less fluid goes through. The wider the radius, the more fluid goes through. So systolic blood pressure, SBP, is the contraction phase of our heart. Diastolic, the DBP, is the relaxation phase of our heart. Our aorta, we're always going to have higher pressure in our arteries over our veins because we need to maintain that driving pressure. Our aorta fluctuates between 120 and 80 millimeters of mercury. 93 is our average map at rest. Vena cava is between about 4 and 8 millimeters of mercury pressure. Right atrium fluctuates between 5 and 0, with an average about 1.6. The pulmonary trunk, so the pulmonary artery, fluctuates between 15 and 5, with an average about 8.3. MAP, mean arterial blood pressure, is the average blood pressure over time. At rest, this is the equation. At rest, about 1/3 of the cardiac cycle is the systolic phase. So we got 1/3 systolic blood pressure plus 2/3 diastolic blood pressure. So if you're given, 120 over 80, what's the map for somebody with a blood pressure of 120 over 80? Well, it's 93. Pulse pressure. Pulse pressure is the difference between systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. It's a good indication of stroke volume. If your pulse pressure is really low, if you have a patient that comes in and you notice their pulse pressure is really low, you might think, this person's having an issue with their stroke volume maybe. I should look into that more. So it's a good indication of stroke volume. Stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So how much volume, what's the change in volume of the ventricle when it contracts? And diastolic volume, how much fluid is in it when it's completely full. And systolic volume, how much fluid's in it after it's squeezed out all that fluid that it can during a contraction cycle. Pressure decreases through the system due to resistance. So why is there high blood pressure in the aorta and then it gets lower throughout the system? It gets lower throughout the system because of resistance. Resistance is the reason why pressure decreases throughout the system. Ventricular performance. So our heart, we want it to be as efficient as possible. We want it to be as efficient as possible. So every time the heart beats, it's got to work. Your heart starts beating before you're born, and it stops beating at the end. It's good to work out your heart for a few hours, 4 days a week, for an hour, 4 or 5 days a week. It's not good to work out your heart every moment of every day. That puts a lot of stress on your heart. So let's look at a few factors that affect your heart's performance. Stroke volume, or SV. Stroke volume is what we were just talking about. It's the volume pumped per contraction. You can estimate it by pulse pressure. So pulse pressure is equal to systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure. Stroke volume is calculated by end diastolic minus end systolic volume. Ejection fraction, EF, is the percentage of blood ejected. So percentage of blood ejected. So we need to do a percentage. So we have EF is equal to stroke volume over end diastolic volume times 100 to get our percentage. So stroke volume is how much is pumped out, and diastolic volume is the amount of a completely full ventricular chamber times 100. Cardiac output. Cardiac output is volume of blood pumped per minute. And it's going to have two main variables, stroke volume and heart rate. So stroke volume is how much gets pumped per beat, and heart rate's how many beats there are per minute. So how much gets pumped per beat and how many beats there are per minute will give you cardiac output. At rest, we might have 70 milliliters pumped out per beat, get 70 beats per minute. About 5 liters would be an at-rest cardiac output. During rigorous exercise, you might get 150 milliliters per beat times 200 beats. That's pretty extreme, actually. But just for the example, times 200 beats per minute, 30 liters per minute. That's definitely on the high end right there. But you can see how much it changes. You definitely see how much it changes. Cardiac patient, 25 milliliters per beat. That's a really low stroke volume. So something's definitely wrong with this patient's stroke volume. 40 beats per minute. That's a really low heart rate. About 1 liter per minute. So this person's definitely having issues with their pumping their heart or pumping their blood. Cardiac output's only 1 liter per minute. So mean arterial blood pressure is regulated, not flow. I'm actually going to end this video here. This is a good spot to start our next part of this video series. So if you have any questions, as always, let me know. I'm here to help, and I will see you in part 3